let's have a little lesson on fractions. Okay. So let's talk about what a fraction is. What does it mean? If I have the fraction 3/4, mathematically speaking, it means 3 divided by 4. Fraction bar means to divide. And so if we were to divide this on the calculator, that's how we get our decimal numbers. And so 3/4 or 3 out of 4 would be equal to the decimal 0.75 or 75 hundredths. So if I ask you to make an equivalent fraction to 3/4, equivalent, that means one that's equal to 3/4. It's not exactly the same as 3/4, but it has the same value. So 3/4, if I want an equivalent one, well, we know the decimal representation is 0.75, which is 75 hundredths. So we could write 75 over 100. And that makes sense, because think about this as money for just a second. There are 3 quarters in 75 cents, and there are 4 quarters in $1. So 75 over 100 is the same as 3 over 4. So to make these equivalent fractions, we use multiplication. I know these are equivalent because if I multiply the denominator and I multiply the numerator by the same number, then I would get the 75 over 100, and let's say I multiply by 25. Okay, so 3 times 25 is 75, and 4 times 25 is 100. So I'm multiplying this fraction, 3/4, by 25 over 25. So it would look like this: 3/4 times 25 over 25. Well, we all know that 25 over 25 is equal to 1. And so I'm not changing the value, like I said, of the fraction. I'm just changing the appearance when I multiply the numerator and the denominator by the same number. And so that's what we call equivalent fractions. Okay, now you're going to have to use equivalent fractions to add fractions and subtract fractions. So if you want to add or subtract fractions, you have to have a common denominator, because you have to have the same size pieces, if that makes any sense. So if you looked at a picture of 3/4, 3/4 would look like this. I have a whole, and I have the whole divided into 4 parts, and I get 3 of those parts. So this is a picture of 3/4. So if I wanted to add 3/4 and another fraction, it would have to be in the same size pieces. So the whole would have to be divided into the same amount of parts. So 3/4 plus 1/4, that's pretty easy. I can add 3/4 and 1/4 because both of these are divided into 4 parts. So I have 3 pieces of the same circle. I have another piece of the same circle. And so then I have 4 pieces of the same circle. Here's 3/4, here's 1/4. So I have 4/4, okay, which is equal to 1 whole. So 1 is equal to 4/4, which is equal to my pictorial representation. So if we want to add fractions or subtract fractions, our wholes have to be divided into the same amount of pieces. So if I was asked to, let's see, if I was asked to take 5/6 plus 3/10, well, I can't just start adding those together right now because they're not the same size of the whole. They have to be the same size of the whole for me to be able to add them. So that's what we call a least common denominator. What we're trying to do is figure out, okay, what can I divide this circle into so that 6 would go into that and 10 would also divide into it. So in this case, we have to find a number that 6 and 10 both go into, and that would be 30. 6 goes into 35 times and 10 goes into 33 times. So we would have to divide this circle into 30 little skinny pieces. Okay? So So in doing that, we would have to rename our fractions. So in order to rename our fractions, we use multiplication. We don't want to change the value of the fraction. We only want to change his name. So we have to get our denominator to be 30. So we ask ourselves, what would I have to multiply by to make this 6 go to 30? And I would have to multiply times 5. So if I multiply the denominator times 5, I have to multiply the numerator times 5. And that will make 5 times 5 is 25, my new fraction. So I do the same here. I know that I started off with 10, but I have to get down to a 30. So I had to multiply times 3. Whatever I multiply the denominator by, I have to multiply the numerator. So 3 times 3 is 9. And now that I have my whole divided into the same pieces, I have 25 pieces here. I have 9 pieces there. So now I can add it together. My whole is still divided into 30 parts. And 25 plus 9 is 34. So the question is, what in the world do I do with that now? Think about that for just a second. You have a whole divided into 30 parts, and you have 34 of those parts shaded in. That's not possible because there's only 30 parts, right? So that means that you have to have a whole and part of another whole. So remember, this whole is shaded into 30 parts. So you would shade this whole in 30 parts. And then you have 4 parts shaded in here. 4 parts shaded in here. So I get 1 whole, and I get 4 out of 30 of the second circle. So 34 over 30 is the same as 1 whole and 4/30. Now each time you do this, you don't want to have to draw a picture representation. I just wanted you to see it in picture form. You can also use division. So if I'm going to use division, remember this is divide, like I said earlier. So this is 34 divided by 30. So how many times will 30 go into 34? 1 whole time. Look at my 1 whole right here. There it is, 1 whole time. So then I write my 30 down. 1 times 30 is 30. 34 minus 30, that gives me 4 left over. Look at the 4 left over right there. There they are. And then how many pieces was my circle divided into? 30 pieces. So 34 over 30 is 1 and 4/30. So this would be your final answer. This works for addition and subtraction. So in these types of problems, you have to find a common denominator. Thank goodness, though, for multiply and divide, we don't have to do all that.